Well, welcome to another church history class. Thank you for being here. Let's start off with a prayer, and then we will get on to the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this evening. Lord, as we wrap up this year of church history, I just thank you so much for your presence and just affording the time and the energy and the willingness, Lord, to all of these students to be here through this time. We have 4 more weeks, and Lord, I just pray that your presence will be with us and that you will continue to grow each one of these students, that you will continue to give them the energy and the will to just continue on and finish strong. And Lord, we just thank you so much for all that you are and all that you're teaching us through this course. And it is in your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so tonight, we sort of started talking about the different classes of government and how we kind of had to have that information in order to talk about this particular time in history that did have some effect on the church. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is a little bit more secular than it is church related. But it's very interesting. All of this is working up to talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's the focus of this first part of the lecture, but we have to kind of talk about all this other stuff to make him and what he did a little bit more significant. So last week we talked about this, we started trying to tease apart, especially when you start talking about socialism versus communism. There's lots of stuff out on the web about the differences between those two, and depending on there are different viewpoints all over the place. And in general, they are very, 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 very similar. They both have classless societies. They both take the ability to have private ownership from the people as individuals or even as corporations, entities, and all of that is government run. The government basically owns, in general, the government owns everything and then is responsible for distributing all of that wealth evenly amongst all the people, right? Instead of counting on an individual to not hoard or whatever, right? So this idea, we also hit very briefly the term totalitarianism. So communism and Nazism both, and Nazism is a form of communism, sort of. These things overlap so much. Like almost anything I say about what is Nazism, what is communism, what is socialism, what is fascism, like there are distinct terms for all of these things, but when you try to put them together into a story and say, okay, this is this, and it leads to this, and it comes back to that, and it's influenced by this, there's so much overlap that it's very difficult to tease some of these concepts apart. But in general, a totalitarianistic system is almost always a bordering on, if not fully communistic system. And one of the general things, it's funny, you get all of these general characteristics that you kind of have to tease through and figure out, what are you really trying to say? One of the things that is interesting that sort of flows through trying to describe totalitarianism is less about the government, which is kind of how it's described. This is a system of government that is described by blah, 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 right? Really, if you read into it and sort of look underneath that, you'll see that there is this underlying attitude of the people. The people have lost their will or their fortitude to have any freedoms. And if you think about that, just that statement, and think about the end of World War I and the turmoil that Germany was in and all of the things that they were going through, right, as a nation, and trying to recover, trying to bounce back, trying to have any system of government, just trying to survive as a people and as a nation. It's easy to see how something coming off the skirt tail of that would lead people into a generalized state of, I don't really care if I have personal freedoms. I don't really care about this and that. I don't care if the government runs things. Just kind of I just want to eat. I just want my family to survive. I just want to find a job, whatever. whatever attitudes. I'm making it very simplistic, but in general, that's the spirit of the attitude of totalitarianism. If the people, again, generally speaking, if the people don't have that attitude, it's very difficult to institute a system like totalitarianism, because that system is especially coming from a capitalist perspective, which is what our nation is, looking onto or trying to understand a system of communism or a totalitarianistic communistic system, blah, blah, blah. Say that even, 2 times, whatever. Anyway, it's difficult for us to look onto that and see and think, why aren't you people standing up? Why aren't you doing anything? Why don't you rise up? Why don't you do something? Well, when you think about where Germany is and what they've just come out of, I mean, they were flying high. They were literally almost at the very top of the entire known world, everything. And then they lost it all. And then when they lost it all, the humiliation was poured on top of that, partly with the Treaty of Versailles, and then just some other perspectives, the way other nations were viewing them, the way they were treated. They were having to pay all this stuff out when their nation was basically ravaged. They had no military. And so, and then the people are just supposed to rise up out of that and start making demands. Okay. I mean, it's not feasible, right? So it's easy to look back on history and see how this could have happened with them. But looking back on it without trying, I don't know if you guys ever watched Friends. Whenever they went to London and Joey walks out of the hotel and he has his 3D map, like he unfolds it and all these buildings pop up and he's like, okay, well, or no, maybe it wasn't 3D. Maybe it was just a flat map. I can't remember. But anyway, was it flat? Yeah. Okay, so then he rolls out and he's doing this. He's like, okay, so let's see, and Chandler is standing next to him going, oh my gosh, what are you doing? So he says, okay, I don't know where I'm at. I'm going to have to get in the map. And he puts the map down and he stands in it and he's going that way, or whatever. And he suddenly has this perspective, That's how I feel. Like when you're thinking back, and it's easy to judge the nations, it's easy to judge history, it's easy to look back on it and say, what's wrong with you, or how could you, or good for you, or whatever it is that you feel about history. But it's so valuable and so informative if you can get into the map. If you can put yourself into Germany for just a moment, where we're going to talk about this in a second, but where all of these things that are listed up here that we're just going to kind of blow through in a minute, all these things are happening all around them. And then somebody very, very smart, very charismatic, very powerful is given some authority, and he begins to say, this is a great nation. I'm not going to let you all forget that this is a great nation. And you are a great people of a great nation. And, beginning to say, come on, you guys, let's go. Let's do this. Let's rebuild this nation and get it back on its feet. And the people who previously were just like, whatever, like, I don't even know where I'm going to get my next meal, they start not just hearing somebody blowing wind, but actually doing something. Movement is starting to take place. And as a nation, they begin to very strongly back this very charismatic, very powerful, bright leader, right? So anyway, this totalitarianistic system that was being created in Germany was really almost a consequence of the previous decade of history, right? That culminated with the end of World War II. So just as a way of reminder, communism is basically a classless society. There's no private property owned by any individuals or any corporations. There's no capitalistic enterprise at all. And that sounds a lot like a socialist government, right? It's very, very similar. Where this went into an area of communism is a form of communism which is Marxist in its roots, began to form under Hitler that was called Nazism. Okay? So Nazism is a form of totalitarianistic communism, right? Now, depending on your source, they may or may not agree with that statement. It's interesting because of all of the overlap here and there, but that's what I'm going to say it is, right? Nazism is a form of this communism, and the reason that history looks back on that, not everybody agrees. Some people say there's never been a communistic state, ever, like a truly communist state. I'll let you guys figure that out and decide for yourselves, but for the purposes of this class, Nazism was a natural communistic state that developed under Hitler as Germany was rebounding from World War I and rebounding from the Treaty of Versailles and rebounding from all of the looks from the rest of the world that Germany was getting, right? So they lost a lot of their land. They were heavily taxed. Their military was depleted and what is it called when they take their munitioned? Whatever. All their ammo was taken, or only really low class, like not very powerful, not very threatening weapons. They were allowed to have those, but nothing, nothing that would do any real damage. And remember that Weimar period, the city called Weimar, where the government tried to reconnect itself and get something going. They wrote a constitution and they put some people into government. Some of those people were, in general, the leadership was just weak. And again, coming off the skirt tails, many of the trusted and beloved politicians were older. Many of the new people were very inexperienced, didn't really know what was happening, maybe didn't have the right attitude. They were just looking for a job. They'd say anything to get a job, whatever. It just wasn't a strong governmental system. Their constitution was weak and basically imploded in or disintegrated. And these financial issues, Germany was already having nationwide financial issues. And then because in part, not in totality, but in part because of this treaty, and then of course things like the United States had lent them money, the Great Depression hit, and those debts were called in. They called in their marks for Germany because we need that money because now we're struggling, we're about to go down, and Germany's like, I don't have any money, so that's why we took a loan from you, So all of this just contributed to making this nation ready to accept and a leader that had some skill, right? Now, had history gone in a different way and someone other than Hitler had gone into power, we may have had a different, Germany may have gone in a different direction. It may have been better, it may have been worse, who knows? But for all intents and purposes, this is what it is. This man Hitler was given a position of authority. Shortly after this was basically known to be a failing system, and it was kind of being chunked away, but there was still a government that was trying to be established. He was put into a fairly high government position, give or take, and he took it by the horns and ran with it. And he began what is known as a fascist movement in Germany. Fascism is generally characterized as a love of or glorification of a nation, but under very, very tight control. So lots of nations glorify themselves. There are very few nations that don't have pride in the way that their nation runs, the way their military power is displayed, blah, 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 right? Maybe the way their arts have been, like back in the Renaissance, one of the national prides was just the artwork and the artistry and the artists themselves that were coming out of Italy and all of those Renaissance countries, right? So national pride is definitely not unique to Germany, but they're kind of in a bad place nationally. Here comes this, so this fails. Here comes this guy, and he says, man, we are a great nation, and we are great people, and we just have to remember who we are. And so this idea of national pride was a center point in his campaign. This tight control that he had over the nation was not quite so much what you would expect out of for lack of a better word, a normal leader. He, from the very beginning, had a little bit of a tight grip on what was happening in the country. As his power grew, as his success got better, as he began to flourish, it just got tighter and tighter and tighter. And I think I mentioned this last week, but if you read up on Hitler, and it depends, again, be very careful when you read up on very well-known historical figures, because depending on who's writing the article, you're going to get a very strong bias. It doesn't mean that it's a wrong perspective. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means it's very biased. So there are very few people who will look back on what Hitler did and think, oh, well, he was just misunderstood. But you can get the same message and very different biases. You know, one message may leave you feeling militant, and another message may leave you feeling warned. Like, that's the same thing. You know, the same sort of information is put out, but how it's given to you. So just be careful, especially when you start getting into very powerful sort of crazy people running nations, because you'll end up getting caught up in a fervor if you're not careful. Anyway, whatever. That's just me talking. Whatever. Take it for what it's worth. This tight control he had over the nation, especially as his regime began to become very successful, he basically closed off the entire nation. There was, I mean, people could come in and out, but who was able to speak where, what they were able to say? The media was completely 100% governmental controlled. You heard what they wanted you to hear and nothing more. There was threat of violence or death if you went against what was happening with the government. So it was not... While he took control and the nation as a whole was behind him as far as, yes, let's get the nation back, he just really took that power and sort of ran with it. And it began with this fascist attitude. The flag that they had, depending on the source that you read, most of the sources that I read, which wasn't a lot, maybe 5 or 6, 8, something like that, most of those sources I read indicate that flag, that the Nazi flag that they had, was actually a representation of like a national attitude, where so the flag is basically it's got a black background like this, and then kind of a center point, and it's all black, and then it's got the swastika like that in there. So all of this black is, by some sources' accounts, is a representative of soil, like the land. This is our nation. This symbol, if you just do a search on the swastika, it didn't get a bad name until Hitler put it on his flag. It was actually a symbol of good fortune and luck, and not fertility, but just, well, like it was a good thing, which is probably why he put it in the middle of his flag. Good fortune for the nation. And the red portion, like, I can't remember if this part is red or I think around the swastika was red. Anyway, the portion of the flag that was red, that was indicating the blood that had been spilt by this nation, and yet it endured. So there are reasons behind the Nazi flag that most people, now I don't know that those are true. Most of the sources agree or have some connotation of that being true. I don't know what the source is, but just assuming that it's true, it puts a different perspective on where that flag came from and why it was being raised. It ended up, because Hitler lost his mind and went a little crazy, it ended up being a symbol of anti-Semitism and racial cleansing, ethnic cleansing, right? So it's no longer, no one is going to look at that. I'm not even sure that Germany can look at that flag and think, national pride, and, you know, I mean, it just doesn't happen. He ruined it, right? So.
Would you say that the way you described the state during that time, it's kind of similar how North Korea is described today?
Yes. It is actually very similar to that. I don't know. You know what? I would have to look up. It actually is probably, like from the outside world, it's probably considered totalitarianistic and communistic. Fascist, maybe. Maybe. That's a little bit iffy, but it's possible. Anyway, yeah, but you're right. Okay, so anyway, so this sort of communistic movement called Nazism came out under Hitler, and it was a fascist movement that was really driven by this like, let's bring the nation back to life. And it ended up being basically a dictatorship, which, again, most people would call a characteristic of communism. Some people think that, some people don't. But it became a dictatorship where Hitler had the ultimate authority, whatever title you want to put on that. Totalitarianistic, communistic, dictatorship, whatever. He had absolute authority over everything that happened in that nation before it was said and done. Okay? Now, what makes Nazism unique to other communistic adventures or whatever that have happened in history is the uniqueness that included this racial bigotry. So not all communist countries are racist, right? Nazism is defined by its racism, okay? So part of this national awakening that he was trying to do included saying, you know, our people are a good people, a good nation with good people, and we want to keep those people. We want to make sure that our nation survives and that we go forward. We want to keep our nation pure. Started turning into that. We want to make sure that foreign influences, which you could say France if you wanted, because they came after him pretty hard, you know, whatever, maybe, maybe not. But we want to, not only are we a great people, but we're great because we're German. We're great because this is our land. And we need to keep that lineage. We need to keep that purity in our people, right? And it became a point, again, in his campaign. Let's rebuild the nation strong, and let's keep it pure. And let's make sure that since we are the superior race, clearly we are the superior race, let's keep it superior by keeping it clean and perfecting it, right? And so from that came, especially from the outside world, whenever we started paying attention, came this idea of, well, you know, he started getting pressure. Well, what are you doing? What are you thinking? What is this? What is that? Hitler was Catholic. He was a Catholic boy, which is not surprising. That whole area, you know, basically Catholic, right? So he was a Catholic boy, and by the time he got into his power, into his leadership, he completely dropped all of that. And this Nazism became the national religion. It basically became the national religion of, you are German, you are living in Germany, you are a Nazi, and you are part of the Nazi religion. And that religion included what they called a Nazi Jesus. And it was a totally reconfigured person with absolutely no Jewish heritage at all. You can read up on that if you want. It's crazy. So he had effectively, in the few years that he was in power, he had as the pro, he kind of brought a nation back to life. And he got this nation back on its feet, right? It wasn't really going anywhere. It was just struggling. Kind of brought this nation and woke it up, right? Gave it a little spank and woke it up, right? The con to that is the way that he chose to do it. He brought in this total overseeing of power and control, and then threw in racist beliefs, and it turned out at the end of his leadership to be a period of ethnic cleansing where 6 million Jewish people died in concentration camps. And it wasn't just Jewish people who were dying. Anyone who opposed the government was pretty much on the list, right? But because of the nature of his directed assault on the Jewish people themselves, it's a period of ethnic cleansing in general of the Jewish people and of the Jewish nation. He tried to completely eliminate, and it just didn't work out.
It's funny or ironic how the Jews thought because of their bloodline they were better than everyone else. And here it's based kind of a parallel, so to speak. And they're the Samaritans of the story.
Right. It's very interesting. Anytime, everyone has their reason for thinking that they're superior. That reason for superiority may or may not have any foundation underneath it. But the bottom line is if you get if you take your own superiority or the superiority of your, environment, and you have the ability, I mean, the nation was just waiting. Kind of like, we touched on this before with, he used a lot of, he got a lot of, this is just amazing. He got a lot of people going on the anti-Semitic wagon, going back to Jesus being killed. But it was his version of Jesus. And the nation, I don't really think they cared one way or the other. Like, I don't really know that people were, I think they were just like, whatever. Like, you're bringing the nation back, and we don't have time to deal with whether or not you have good theology. That's just speculation on my part. But it's interesting that he brought in a little bit of his own religious upbringing, and then that whole seedbed of anti-Semitism that was started way, way back whenever Rome fell. And, oh yeah, those people on top of Masada 40 years out, so Jesus is about to be taken. Is it going to be Barabbas or is it going to be Jesus? And the crowd says, crucify Jesus. And Pilate is up there saying he didn't do anything. And the Jewish people are saying, the leadership, the representation is saying, let his blood be on us and our family, right? Or our sons, right? So they take him out. 40 years to the day, they're up on the zealots who escaped after Rome fell, are up on Masada, and the ramp is built by Rome. They get up on top and everybody's dead, right? Except for a couple of people in a grain silo, whatever, that told the story about what happened. And people began to look back on that and say, oh, well, they got what they deserved. They got their blood on them and their children, just like they got what they asked for, they got what they deserved. They killed Jesus anyway. And they began to have this seedbed of anti-Semitism that Martin Luther, unfortunately, was, especially in his later life, was very vocally anti-Semitic. And he didn't start that, but it's all oral tradition that dates back, right? And you can see a thread. Now, is it direct cause and effect? Maybe, maybe not. But there's just a very interesting underlying tone of anti-Semitism that started way a long time ago that was brewing under the surface. Then Germany gets spanked, right? And they're all flipping out and they don't know what to do. And this very, very charismatic man comes on the scene, revives the nation that has been, if you believe it, or if you think there's any fortitude to this idea, this very under the surface anti-Semitic nation. He comes up and says, well, it's all their fault. They're just still causing trouble. And here comes a whole nation after the Jewish people. It's crazy. Like, it's very interesting to, if you take, even if you don't buy it completely, if you just take the notion that there is anti-Semitism brewing for hundreds of years, and then just at the perfect time, here comes somebody who is anti-Semitic, and the whole nation explodes, and you have 6 million people who pay the price for that.
It's almost like the perfect storm. The whole thing is like the perfect storm, and they needed a focal point to take their mind off of what they were going through.
Yep.
And he gave them a focal point.
That's right. And had they been productive and wealthy and able and their spirit wasn't broken, would he have been able to come in and do that? Maybe.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. But if you come into a broken place and you fix it, whoever's been fixed, they're on board. Let's go. Let's do this thing, right? That's how it is. So anyway, it's just one perspective. You can do your own research and figure out whether you agree or disagree with all of that, back history. But definitely Hitler was, he was a piece of work.
There's a documentary
So,
on Amazon Prime called Nazi Jesus.
Is there really?
I watched it since last weekend.
Oh, nice. Oh, you should be giving a lecture. Get up here. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't know that. I'll have to watch it. Is it? Gosh, it's crazy how it worked out.
He compared himself to his continuing Jesus work. And
Yeah.
Jesus died because of the Jews.
Yep.
He used that as we're going to take all the Jews, round them up. And
Yeah. Yep, all about, and we're going to go into Vatican II. We're going to go into Vatican II, and we're going to talk a little bit about that too. It's very interesting. So anyway, so where does the church stand during all of this? The church was basically on board. In general, generally speaking, the churches that were in existence in Germany at this time were on board. I'll give you a couple of quotes. This is from a man named Pastor Hermann Gruner. He says, "The time is fulfilled for the German people of Hitler. It is because of Hitler that Christ, God the Helper and Redeemer, has become effective among us." Christ is effective among us because of Hitler. That's what he just said. Hitler is the way of the Spirit and the will of God for the German people to enter into the Church of Christ. So what he just said, what Lloyd just said about his continuation of, that's exactly what that quote is backing up. There was another unnamed, I don't know who said this, but somebody else was quoted as saying, Christ has come to us through Hitler. So in general, the Christians who were in Germany were fine with what was happening, okay? Now, there's always exceptions. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Protestant preacher. He lived in Germany. He was in Germany when Hitler came to power, so in the early years, right? He ended up going off to England for a couple of years. By the time he came back to a nation that was firmly in Hitler's grip, and there was just censorship everywhere. He ended up doing some more traveling. He wrote a couple sermons. You can look him up and, look up his sermons, and, one of them is Cost of Discipleship, I think, or something like that, whatever. Anyway, he ended up ultimately back in Germany again. And once he came back, he was officially banned from speaking in any open forum at all in any part of the country. Right? Because he wasn't doing this. He wasn't a Nazi religious spokesperson. So he was banned. There was an underground seminary called Finkenwald. He was a lecturer, teacher, pastor, contributor to that underground cemetery. He did that for years. He did something very interesting. He ended up, so he's doing all this work, and he feels like he's not doing enough. He is not doing enough to try to stop this craziness and continue the cause of Christ, right? He can't be open about it, so what is he going to do? How can he be the most effective? Very interesting. He joined the Secret Service and became a double agent. He ended up having access to not top secret stuff like, he's probably low level, but he ended up having access to certain military and government secrets because of his position. And then he used those to help not just spread the gospel and not just keep the church alive, but more importantly, not to this picture, not to the world at large. Jesus is important, right? But one of the other things that he did was he was smuggling Jewish people out of the country. And he was using his position to do that. The information he attained and the connections he had to safely move people out of Germany. Well, in 1943, he gets caught. And you can read up on how he was caught, blah, blah, blah. It's very dramatic. Anyway, he gets caught, he's arrested, and he's thrown into prison. And he stays in prison for a couple of years. After that couple of years, he ends up being taken to what they called an extermination camp. Okay, and it may have actually overlapped with Jewish concentration camps, or it may not have. I don't know the answer to that. But in either case, they were not treated well. It was basically a concentration camp. I just don't know if it was Jewish populated or if it was just enemies of the state, right? So he ends up getting sent to this camp, and in 1945, about a month before the war ended, he is hung to death. He's put to death by hanging. What's interesting is about 10 years after his death, all these war criminal not documentaries, that's a show. Statements, like government statements from war prisoners who have taken asylum here in the States and whatever, they started coming out. About 10 years later, there was a person, I don't know if I have his name though, just a doctor. I don't have the doctor's name, so take this for what it's worth. A doctor said, He said, this was his quote. He was at the camp the day that Bonhoeffer was hanged. And he says, "The prisoners were taken from their cells and the verdicts of court-martial read out to them. Through the half-open door in one room of the hut, I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer, before taking off his prison garb, kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a prayer and then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued in a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that he has worked as a doctor, how many of those were in Nazi Germany? Who knows? We don't even know if this is a real doctor, but whatever. In the almost 50 years that I have worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." So that was presumably a Nazi doctor kind of singing the praises of Bonhoeffer in retrospect. So anyway, he was a very interesting man. If you have any interest in, there's really interesting stuff out there on him. He's a neat guy living in a very traumatic time. All right, so that's all I have to say about that. The last thing I want to talk about before we leave is, I'm going to skip most of what I was going to talk about because I really want to talk about Vatican II because it's really important. Vatican II is one of the most amazing ecumenical councils that has ever, this is my personal opinion, that has happened. It's an amazing council. So I want to just touch on, I think one of the chapters you're going to read for your homework this week talks about the World Council of Churches. I'm just going to touch on it real quick. Just to explain it a little bit. I honestly don't know too much about it because, well, I'll tell you why. So the WCC for short. This World Council of Churches, it's basically a gathering of churches, an international gathering of churches, okay? It is, in its origins, the whole idea was we are all Christians no matter what faith we are professing or denomination or whatever. We are all Christians and we should all be working under one umbrella, working with each other, helping each other, that kind of thing. So that was the origins of this. And it's still, I mean, in effect, that's still the goal of the WCC today. However, what began to happen after it formed, and basically all of these different nations, literally from all over the world, were coming in and joining this council, and issues were coming up. And the stances that were being taken on the issues began to get softer and more flexible and, depending on your viewpoint, weaker, okay? So, for example, there are, like, I don't know, pick a topic that the church has issue with, okay? And in that country, that offense is, you go to prison for the rest of your life. In that country, you lose your life. In that country, you're just told, stop doing that. You know you're not supposed to be doing that, and you move on with your life. So there's this whole spectrum. You have all these different viewpoints coming in, and you have this one thing that, I mean, they talked about a lot of things, but I'm just giving you an example. There's one thing that they're talking about, and you have this nation who's saying they should never see the light of day again. And that nation's saying, light of day? They should not even breathe another breath again. And this nation is like, whoa, you guys are so crazy. Like, we are focusing on the wrong thing. Like settle down, you know? And so you have all these different perspectives, and they have to come to an answer. Like, it's a council that needs to come to, or a gathering of people that has one answer, not a spectrum of answers based on where you live, right? And so because of that, and again, depending on your background, people began to look in on that and say, wow, the church is compromising, especially nations that had very strong stances on whatever the issue is. They're looking in on a council that's not being strong about that, that's not being aggressive about it, and saying, whoa, you're getting weak. While this nation is like, wow, you need to settle down. I don't really think you're pushing it a little too hard. And so you start having this meeting in the middle flexible compromise ending coming out of it. Well, and it's not so much, that's not to say that everything, or even the majority of things that come out of the WCC are compromised and invalid or against God or Scripture or anything else. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that there are three different groups of people that because of what they perceived as being compromised in this WCC organization, they refused membership. They refused the invitation to join the council. Those three groups, one is the Roman Catholic Church. Two is Eastern Orthodoxy. And third, Evangelical Christianity. AN. Okay? So you have, they refused membership, or they refused their invitation into the WCC. Now, I said at the beginning of all this that I don't really know too much about the WCC. I actually had never heard of the WCC before I took church history. I didn't have any idea what it was. And quite frankly, I still don't know a lot about what it is. But part of the reason that I had never heard of it before is because the United States is basically Roman Catholic. The United States is a Roman Catholic, generally speaking. And if you're not Roman Catholic, you're some form of Protestant. You may not be an evangelical, but you're some form of Protestant. And so the WCC, while it's alive and strong and working and doing its thing, it's much more well known in the European country, just in other areas of the world. Whereas in the United States, we're like, what? What's the WCC? And it's just basically because of our religious base here. We just don't have we're not part of it, and so we don't have a lot of opportunity to know what's going on with it, right? But anyway, it's a very strong group of people basically across the world, but very weak in the United States. Okay, I just thought I'd mention it, and the book goes into a little bit, not a whole lot, but just mention it, and especially these three groups of people that refused to join. And basically because they looked at what was happening and what was coming out of it and saying, no, you're compromising everything. We're not going to do that. We're not going to be a part of that. Okay? All right, so that's all I want to say about that. The last, maybe 5 minutes over, I want to talk about Vatican II. Vatican II, okay, so we have had a couple of important ecumenical councils in the last few weeks. One of them was the Council of Trent, right? And generally speaking, that was a reaction to the Protestant movement, right? People were beginning to leave the Catholic Church in larger numbers than what the church had seen in previous history, and going into these Protestant churches, and the Catholic Church said, we need to make sure that we know what we believe, and we need to make sure that the people who are Roman Catholic have security in what we believe, right? So the Council of Trent was formed, and these doctrines came out of it, like the Index, and all these things were reaffirmed, right? Then, remember, Vatican I happened, and that was basically a reaction to many things, one of which was this sort of invasion of Italy, where the Pope felt like he was a prisoner in the Vatican, couldn't leave, do all these things. And what came out of that was not so much, we need to assert doctrine over the people, the Council of Trent did that, and we're good with what happened there. This was more of I have authority as the leadership of the church. The Pope has authority, therefore the church has authority. It was given by God, this papal infallibility, these things that are spoken ex cathedra become unquestionable parts of church idea and doctrine, for lack of a better word, right? So that was Vatican I. Well, Vatican II, the year was 1869 to 1870. So this was actually a 4-part council, and Vatican II. All right. It was called by this man that put Vatican II together. He was I'm sorry, I gave you the Vatican I. I knew 18 was wrong. See, 19, I was like, I thought it was in my 1962 to 1965. I'm sorry. I read Vatican I and took those numbers. Okay, so Vatican II. That makes a lot more sense. All right, Vatican II happens. This man named Pope John the 23rd. Very, very interesting pope. And depending on your stance, either extremely awesome and fantastic or extremely radical. Kind of depended on where you were. The older you were and the more entrenched you were in Roman Catholic doctrine, the more radical he seemed. Okay? So Pope John the 23rd, he was very unique because he was a people person. He was getting back to sort of the spirit of Gregory the Great and other early popes that were ministers to the people, and not ministers to the people necessarily from something that they wrote that's being read to the people and they may be in the back room or just being shouted over a balcony. He wanted to engage. He wanted the Roman Catholic Church, like he personally, but also he representing the church as a whole, he wanted the church to stop being so closed off and such a mystery to the people and open up its doors, invite the people in, get to know the people again, share the word of God, share who Christ is, and just become one with the people again. He wanted to break down walls that had been formed in times past, like whenever France decided to be a completely atheistic country and they ran all those priests out of the country and whatever, and the Roman Catholic Church as an entity was like, we've got to get control over these people. If we don't have control over them, this is how they behave. And walls were just being built through different acts in history like that. That's just one example. But, so all these walls were being built, and the power of the Pope and the power of the church and the wall and the you're there and the we're here and just very separate. John the 23rd came along and he said, we're the church. We are supposed to be for the people and with the people. That sounds like the Constitution, but like we're supposed to be, or what Abe Lincoln or whoever said it. But anyway, so, he was interested in reuniting the church with its people. And it was a little bit of a radical viewpoint for that time. I mean, it's a little scary for the church, right? He had this inner circle, this group of people called the Curia. These were men who were basically his eldership, for lack of a better word. These were the men who were placed around him, who were there to protect him, sometimes physically, but protect him, making sure that what he says is being enforced, making sure that what he says makes sense with Scripture. Like, they were just his support system, right? And they were certainly there to make sure that nobody outside of the Pope was a threat to him, whether it was what he said or where he went or how he behaved or whatever. They were they were just protection on almost every level. They weren't carrying guns, not that kind of protection, but they just were very tight. It was his inner circle of people that he had around him all the time. So John the 23rd calls this ecumenical council. And the Curia do what they have always done for centuries. And they typed up a list of people, because there were going to be people were going to get appointed to certain positions, and there were going to be changes in title and position for different people, like things were going to happen at this council. And so they typed up a list of people that they then normally would hand out this list to all the people who attended the ecumenical council and say, okay, these are the people you have to choose from to vote. This is who we want you to vote for this, and this is who we want you to vote for that. It was basically a list where they're telling the people what to vote. And it had been that way for a long time. It was completely, that's what we do, right? Well, this council, his attitude was infectious. He was wanting people to be able to come into the Vatican. Whenever he was out walking in the garden, like he was out exposed, and he wanted people to be able to come in and see him. Maybe they're in the Vatican and they're just taking a tour and they look out a window. He wanted to be able to be seen. Like, what's wrong with them seeing me walking in the garden? That's what I do. I do that every day. Let them see me walking in the garden. It's no big deal, right? And I mean, and, you know, of course, at that time, they were like, no, we got to hide the Pope. You know, they were kind of crazy about it. And for good reason. They had their reasons for being in that place. But his attitude was so warm and loving and friendly. When he reached out to all of these Roman Catholic churches all around the world, people really responded. It was the largest attended ecumenical council to date. Like, people were coming in from everywhere, and they wanted to hear what he had to say. What's really interesting is in the second, so I told you there were 4 pieces to this. In that second, I think it's the second, meeting of that council, he actually allowed Protestants to come into the meeting. They were not allowed to speak, and they were not allowed to vote, but they were allowed to come in and listen to the proceedings of the council. That has never been done before. And he's like, what do we have to hide? So they're not Roman Catholic. They're still Christians. Let them in. Let them in and let them hear what we're doing. We have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. You know, and there's this like collective gasp, you know, as the Protestants come into this ecumenical council. It was amazing. The third one, women were allowed to come in. What? Women were allowed to come in and listen. Again, no voting power and no ability to speak, you know, on the floor or offer an opinion or whatever, but allowed to be part of the council and just listen. I mean, it was amazing. It was radical and just blowing out barriers and walls left and right. And people, and then the secular community is like, whoa, look at the Catholic Church letting the women in. I mean, like, seriously, look at them letting in other Christians besides Roman Catholics. What is that all about? I mean, totally got everybody's attention. It was very eye-opening for everybody. Like, and the Curia, oh, I forgot to tell you this. Oh my gosh, you guys, so crazy. That first meeting, okay, you've got all these people. So this is just the Roman Catholic people right now. They're all come in, these representatives, all these priests or whoever, you know, coming in from all over. So the Curia hand out their little things. This is how we want you to vote. So somebody, I think I have the guy's name. I don't know if I wrote it down or not. But this guy from France, I think, he says, well, if I can find it, I'll tell you after class so I don't keep you if you don't want to hear about it. But anyway, this guy says, how am I supposed to vote for somebody that I've never heard of? I don't know who any of these people are. I'm from, presumably, if I'm remembering right, I'm from France. I don't know who any of these people are. They're all Italian, right? They're all from your place. So how am I supposed to vote for anybody? I don't even know anybody. I move that we put the vote off and we spend the next couple of days in fellowship, getting to know one another and understanding, you know, who we are as Christians and people. This dude, he's like, right on, you know, somebody seconds it. The whole thing lasts 15 minutes. The first one lasted 15 minutes. They adjourned and they spent the next 2 days in fellowship. And then when they reconvened, they had, you know, whatever voting things that they do. That list that the Curia had put out, hardly anybody that was on that list ended up being in any sort of position like where they had placed them. These guys twisted up, like did not know what was going on with that. But it was a true, it became, at that point, as soon as people from other areas began to have a voice within the Roman Catholic Church, because of this council, what you'll read a lot is that Vatican II resulted in a true cross-section of Roman Catholicism, because it wasn't just the Italians or whoever that were running things for the rest of the world. It was the rest of the world coming in and actually being a part of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, wow, totally just radical, right? So anyhow, so Pope John the 23rd, he does all these things. Well, tragedy strikes, and he dies from natural causes before this council ends. A new pope comes on the scene, whose name I'm sure I wrote it down, but I'm so fired up, I don't know where I'm at. John the 6th, it looks like, was put into power after John the 23rd dies. He goes into power, and now everybody is like, are we going to continue the Vatican II Council or not? What's going to happen? What is he going to say? So this was this guy's opportunity. Like, if he was old school, so to speak, lack of a better term, he could have taken and stopped Vatican II right there, and that would have been the end of it. Or if he was sort of on board with what was happening with what John the 23rd was doing, he had the opportunity to continue it, and he did choose to continue it. So it went through these 4 sessions, and some very interesting things came out of it. I'm just going to go through a couple of them real quick. This is when, so Vatican II is the time when the Tridentine Mass, meaning that the Latin, the Mass spoken in Latin, that was reversed. And also, so the priest used to have his back toward the congregation and he spoke Latin. After Vatican II, he faced the congregation and spoke in the language of the people. So that was one thing that came out of Vatican II. The official view of the relationship between Roman Catholics and specifically Protestants and Eastern Orthodoxy was the barriers were broken down. Up until this point, they were considered separated brethren of the same basic faith, but not playing well with each other. Vatican II was a step toward the Roman Catholic Church saying, what we have done to cause the separation, we apologize for. And we want everybody to get along. There was a formal apology given to the ecumenical patriarch over Eastern Orthodoxy. He was in attendance. There was a formal apology given and a formal invitation for, renewed and continued friendship. Because remember, 1054, the excommunication, right? Vatican II basically reversed that excommunication and said, we were wrong, that never should have happened, you are our brothers, and we're all Christians, let's all just get along. Now, on paper, that's what happened. The separation physically, it's still very, very separate, but I think a lot of the, stuff that happens is beginning to go away. It'll take a while. The formal view of the Catholic Church on the Jewish nation, as far as their stance on the Jews are responsible for killing Christ. As much anti-Semitism as the Catholic Church held on to for all these years, it was completely reversed. You can find, I have a couple of copies up here, you can find the language, it's translated into our language, but you can find where they say, while it is true that the Jewish people while it's true that Jews were responsible for Christ's death, it cannot be put on every Jew, and it cannot be put on a nation to continually pay for his death. And it even goes on to say that without his death, we would all be lost. There's a reason for his death, right? And so there was an official stance taken by the Roman Catholic Church that they would not say it this way, but basically, we will no longer tolerate any anti-Semitism. We will no longer separate ourselves or berate the Jewish people or any tie their ancestors have to the crucifixion of Christ. So those are just a few things that came out of Vatican II. The index was taken off. The index was no longer, I don't really know how to say it, enforced maybe. It was obliterated. I mean, if you talk to somebody who was alive in the 60s, who was Roman Catholic and was alive when this happened, from what I've been told, those people went from hiding their Bibles, never reading them, keeping them over here. They owned one, but they never looked at it. They never touched it. They never did anything with it because of the index. To their children, not them, because that's a little crazy, can't just change because they signed a paper, but, their children and their children's children leaving Bibles out on the table, going to Bible studies, reading the Bible, doing all these things. And still, the old school people are still a little like, I don't know about that. I'm not too sure we really should be doing that. But because of Vatican II, as the generations move forward, the Bible is less scary and more utilized. So anyway, I kept you so 15 minutes later, but Vatican II is so crazy. If I think of anything else that I forgot, I'll mention it before class next time. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this time. I pray that you will use this information and just ignite a desire to learn more about who you are and this colorful history, Lord, the good, the bad, the crazy, the ugly, the fantastic. Lord, you're in control of all of it. And I just pray that you will continue to reveal who you are through the history of your church. And we just love you, we thank you, and we pray that we will be able to meet again next week and just talk a little bit more about you. And we ask it all in your name, Jesus. Amen.